MNDNR dot mndnr.gov/discover on our website, and you can find all the past recordings on there. This is our 102nd episode. So, Greg, I'd like to welcome Greg Hoke. He's a prairie habitat supervisor with the DNR, also a pretty good author. He's got a couple fantastic books out there on prairie chickens and prairie habitat through it's the Iowa Press, right? They're printed through.
Yeah.
But if anyone wants to look those up and learn more about prairie chicken habitat or prairie chickens, it's a great resource. So I think with that, Greg, I'll turn it over to you, and looking forward to your presentation.
Okay. Just sound check, and can everybody, Benji, can you see my screen?
Yep. You sound
Okay.
good, and screen looks good.
Okay. So first off, thank you to Benji and the other outreach staff for the invitation today. My background, grew up in Indiana, 8 years in the Flint Hills of Kansas for graduate school, moved up to the Agassiz Beach Ridges up in the Northwest Minnesota about 21 years ago. Did a little teaching, worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service for a couple years, and I've been with the DNR for about the last 12 years or so, 11, 12 years. When I was up in the Beach Ridges area, which extend from roughly, let's say, Fergus Falls up to the Crookston-ish area. Really fell in love with the prairie chickens, spent many an April morning out doing surveys, got involved with the Minnesota Prairie Chicken Society, et cetera, et cetera. What I want to present here today is just some of the research I did from putting my first book together a few years ago, and have a lot of historical context, and then a little bit about kind of the modern situation. So just some perceptions. Some of these slides will be a little wordy. I'll kind of read through them slowly. You can also be reading along yourself. So just what people thought of prairie chickens. First off, we'll say the more proper name for a prairie chicken is the pinnated grouse. Pinnae are the little feathers on the back of the neck that stick up over the top of their head when they're booming, and we'll talk about that a little bit later here. So just some of these quotes. The pinnated grouse, commonly known as a prairie chicken, is the most conspicuous member of the grouse family and has been more intimately associated with the development of our country than any other game bird. The history of the prairie chicken has no equal in in the whole American outdoor picture. It is the story of America's finest native grouse, its finest native game bird, perhaps the outstanding subject in all American wildlife. Prairie chickens probably contributed more to the homesteader than the buffalo ever did. The context for that one, there are lots of stories, especially from the Dakotas, of people out trapping prairie chickens, and they would literally eat prairie chickens for breakfast, lunch, and dinner all winter long because they were so abundant back in the day, and there really wasn't much else to eat out there. It is decidedly the finest gallinaceous game, if it may be so called, of America, and affords the greatest sport for those who are so fortunate enough to reside where it abounds. And you can see some of these are fairly well dated. 1866, that's right after the Civil War. Of all the grouse family, this bird, the chicken of shooting lore, probably yields the more complete satisfaction to the great army of American sportsmen, for unquestionably it is the bird of the people. And then more recent, as much as I like hunting pheasants, I'd opt for chickens if I had the choice, both for the nature of the bird and the aesthetic values for where they live. Just some of the beautiful descriptions of this bird, which are completely opposite, but they're all worth quoting here. The prairie chicken is a child of the sullen winter grass. I just love sullen winter grass. Dappled brown like winter prairie field, so that when the wild thing lies close along the grass, an expert eye might forgive itself for not beholding it. It is a bird the color of autumn grass, its feathers disruptively patterned in vertical stripes of switchgrass buff and Indian grass brown, so that a motionless prairie chicken simply fades into the background. And you see over there on the right, that is a female prairie chicken, showing some of that barring and the colors on the feathers, very muted brown. You can see, put that in some fall prairie, and that bird disappears. However, in the spring, they gather on their leks or moving grounds, And John James Audubon described them as not surpassed in pomposity by any other bird. So they're pompously faded, as I like to say. It's really interesting when you read some of the descriptions. So when they get on their booming grounds in the spring, and we'll see this again in a couple slides, the males will puff out their orange neck sacs. And when they do this, it makes this really low frequency. It's called a booming. It also sounds somewhat like a cooing, somewhat similar to a mourning dove, but at a much lower frequency. Um, these sounds carry for quite a while. I know I've been out in the spring, and I think there's a prairie chicken lek just a couple hundred yards over there, and 2 miles of walking, and I haven't found it yet. Some of the early descriptions and people still today, this booming sound, this cooing, this hooting, it can carry for 2 to 3 miles if it's a really cool morning in April and there's no wind. So it really, really carries well. Someone wrote that the prairie chicken's booming was a great comfort to the early pioneers. I can't imagine why. Many things can be said of the prairie chicken's noise, but no measure is it a comfort or is it a comforting or civilized sound. It is a lonely, wild sound made by a lonely, wild bird. If you don't know him, John Madsen's often called the poet laureate of the tallgrass prairie. Primarily did much of his work and writing down in Missouri. Although called booming, their notes have the soft texture and smoothness of a mourning dove's note and the melancholic aspect of some lost soul seeking forgiveness. So if those two phrases don't want to get you out this spring, listening for these guys and watching them, no, I don't know what will. Okay. At the same time, they can elicit a lot of joy in our hearts. It really looks like they're out there having fun. In fact, I've said a couple times before that if there were ever a natural accompaniment to Beethoven's Ode to Joy, it would be a prairie chicken lek in April. In fact, you can almost kind of hear Beethoven in the back of your mind sometimes. So Laskin, he was writing. Some of you may have read this book, the Children's Blizzard. This was a blizzard back in the late 1800s, I believe, that killed dozens, if not hundreds, of people. Once the snow had melted that spring, they found dead horses and cattle and the bodies of several men and school children on the prairie near the homestead. But despite the heartbreak, Mary remembered that never was a spring more beautiful. The birds came back, the flowers bloomed, and the grouse and prairie chickens boomed and strutted on the knoll northwest of our house. Okay, and then Hamlin Garland, is also another very famous writer. I believe he's from Iowa. Late 1800s, early 1900s. Wrote a lot about the prairie back in those days. Spring came to us that year with a sudden beauty, such sweet significance after our long and depressing winter that it seemed like a release from prison. And when at the close of a warm day in March, we could hear the pulsing down through the golden haze of sunset, the mellow boom, boom, boom of the prairie chickens. Our hearts quickened, for this, we were told, was a certain sign of spring. Okay. There are a lot of questions out there about prairie chickens. We didn't have scientists out there on the prairies in the mid to early 1800s doing statistically significant scientific surveys. So almost everything we have out there, like with all wildlife species, it's a lot of anecdotal reports. And one of the questions is, what was the original range of the prairie chicken and the relationship of prairie chicken and settlement and then the breaking of the prairie? So some people have said the prairie chicken was common in regions practically untouched by agriculture, and the prairies were sparsely settled and not an acre in 1,000 had been broken up. The grouse were in immense numbers. And over on the right-hand side, that's one of my favorite Ding Darling drawings, Iowa as we found it, which kind of implies before Euro-American settlement. And the argument could be made that those are quail in the foreground, but when you look at them closely, they do have a barred chest. So I really, really want to tell myself that those are prairie chickens. Okay. The controversy then comes with the following the plow and the axe. So one idea here is that prairie chickens do best when the landscape is about half row crops and about half prairie. The idea here is there's not a lot to eat out in the prairie in the winters. But then if you got too much row crop, there's no place to nest in the summer, the spring and the summer. So when the landscape is about 50-50, they've got plenty of places to nest in the nest, plus they've also got plenty of places to forage all winter long. So you hear in the literature a lot, the chickens followed the plow, or some variation on that, which accounts for the gradual extension westward. And we'll show that in a second here. And then there's also Michigan, Wisconsin, and even northeastern Minnesota, where when the timber barons came in and slicked off a lot of those forests, created a really open landscape, and the prairie chickens actually moved north and east into those areas that had been recently logged off. So my grandfather settled at Marietta, Ohio, and grubbed farmland out of the big tree country of the Northwest Territories in 1883. He said the prairie chickens moved in. And again, there's lots of historical anecdotes about, following the plow and following the axe throughout kind of the mid 1800s or so. Okay. The other thing people talk about is these are not wilderness birds. They talk about they just walk through the streets of town. So Audubon, 1831. In those days during the winter, the grouse would enter the farmyards and feed with the poultry, alighting on the houses or walk the very streets of the villages. They do not retire to the country as the country becomes settled, but continue to lurk in the tall grass around the newly made farms, and I have sometimes seen them mingled with the domestic fowls, a short distance from the farmer's door. And then 1930s, again, writing a little bit historical, they came in from the prairie to feed with the tame hens, alighted on the roofs of the shack before daylight, followed the plow and dusted in the furrows, watered to the horse trough, and scratched in the gardens like a veritable brown leghorn. Okay, so here are a couple of attempts to try to portray the historic and modern range. And there's a couple of take-homes. So the map on the left shows my attempt to try to kind of delineate several published reports of what people thought the pre-Euro-American settlement distribution of prairie chickens was across basically the Midwest. And first off, you can see they kind of line up, but they don't really line up. You can also see two of those lines don't, one line shows them never getting even into northern Iowa, one barely into southern Minnesota, and one kind of up to the Twin Cities area. You can compare that to the modern map shown there on the left. And kind of the thing I want to show from this is if you look at where the modern day distribution is, so they show a little bit up in northwest Minnesota, they show kind of south central South Dakota, north central Nebraska, basically the Sand Hills, and then eastern Kansas, that would be the Flint Hills of Kansas. Most of those areas are either on the edge or outside of where we think the original, again, pre-European settlement distribution of these birds was. Yep. Okay, so we can zoom in a little bit more and trying to piece together kind of the movements of prairie chickens throughout history. So the line across the bottom there, that's one hypothesized distribution of where we think prairie chickens were. We know they were at Fort Snelling, basically the Twin Cities, in 1839. We know they were in the St. Cloud area around 1860. We know they got to Fargo 1879, and we know they got up to the Manitoba border about 1881. We also know, so again, that was kind of following the plow northwest. Then again, we can also see they were following the axe northeast. So 1880s, we've got them a little north of Mille Lacs, or 1900s, we've got them in the Duluth area, and the 19-teens, they're up on the North Shore. Most people, when you think North Shore, you think loons, you think moose, you may think wolves. Most people don't think prairie chickens and open treeless landscapes on the North Shore. But that may be an indication of kind of the effect that we had on the landscape back in the mid to late 1800s. Then the map on the right, again, this is me kind of piecing together the anecdotal information from a lot of different pieces of literature. So we know they made it from, again, 1839, well documented. They were in the Fort Snelling area. In 40 years, they got from the Twin Cities to Fargo. Then from basically 1880 to 1900, they made it to the Montana, North Dakota border. And then by, the 18 teens, they had pretty much made it all over the southern prairie provinces of Canada. So you think about, that's well over 1,000 miles of movement in about 75 plus years. So this species really expanded rapidly with settlement. People also talk about the prairie chicken expanded with the plow, and sharp-tailed grouse, kind of a sister species to prairie chickens, went before the plow. So the prairie chickens followed the plow, and sharp-tailed grouse retreated in front of the plow. Okay, the abundance. So just real quickly before we get to the quotes, just show some of the pictures over here. So these feathers sticking off the back of the neck, these are the pinnae feathers, where the word pinnated grouse comes from. These are the orange sacs. So they'll blow these sacs up and collapse them. And that's what makes that kind of booming, cooing noise. And then they will also erect their tail feathers. And you'll see in a couple slides here, the backside of those feathers is bright white. In fact, quite often when I was out doing surveys, and I try to get out there a good 45 minutes before first light, I would see those white tail feathers long before I would see those orange sacs. So these are two males getting ready to duke it out. And we'll see again a few more pictures of that here later on. Also point out that if you just go Google prairie chicken or prairie chicken lek or prairie chicken booming ground, hundreds and hundreds of photos of males fighting on the lek. And you can also just go to YouTube and again search on prairie chicken, and you'll find hundreds and hundreds of videos of the prairie chickens on the leks. Okay, so the abundance in the spring. After the fires had passed over these tracts, eggs were gathered up by the bushel. So that's a lot of eggs. There were probably a few mallard eggs in there too, but a lot of those are going to be prairie chickens. Several said that one could not walk across the unburned patches of grass without crushing prairie chicken eggs at every step. Okay, some of the abundance in the fall. I saw in October more birds rise out of a 40-acre field than could feed the cities of the Union in a month. Flocks of prairie chickens vast enough to darken the skies as they flew. And then right before we got started here, I was just looking up some other quotes I can read to you here. As recently as 1910, hunting camps were established on the Republican and South Platte rivers, with wagons standing by to receive daily kill. When each wagon left camp for its market, its box, 4 feet wide by 15 feet long, was heaped high with prairie chickens. In autumn and early winter, the sudden and simultaneous rising would make the earth tremble beneath a shooter's feet. Probably a little hyperbole there, but still pretty cool. It was no feat then to kill 100 head a day to each gun. We went out early in the morning and came back about 11 o'clock in the forenoon with 80 grouse. The best shooters bagged 157 birds in a day with 152 shots. In 1875, 4 hunters killed 153 prairie chickens in York Prairie. In Iowa, 3 men killed 410 prairie chickens in 1 hour on an 80-acre field. Captain Bogartis killed 600 prairie chickens in 10 days hunting, only hunting in the mornings and evenings. So the point is, these birds were probably almost indescribably abundant, and probably I don't know if I can wrap my head around it, what the abundance was back in the day, but there were a lot of prairie chickens. Okay. In fact, one of the best ways to show that is when they first started putting telegraph wires up, and the telegraph wires would quite often follow the railroad tracks. There are descriptions of the Iowa Game Survey quotes old timers who, after each stormy evening, made it a practice to pick up gunny sacks full of prairie chickens under the telegraph lines. And the great number of prairie chickens killed by hitting the new wires provided ready supply of meat for the construction workers. So you can imagine a flock of prairie chickens flying over. Statistically, only a very small percentage of those prairie chickens are actually going to hit the wires. Most are going to go over or under. And that little tiny percentage of the flocks that hit the wire, you could fill up gunny sacks and feed a small army of construction workers. And I'm guessing if I'd been out working on the railroad all day, I would probably be pretty hungry in the evening and could probably go through quite a bit of chicken. Okay. One of the more unique aspects of the prairie chicken that you don't see among other game birds in North America is that they were extensively trapped. A lot of species, pheasants, quail, turkey, ruffed grouse, etc., were more heavily hunted in the past than they currently are, but you don't hear a lot about trapping. Prairie chickens, they were heavily trapped. So trapping is done almost exclusively by farmers to destroy more game than all the market hunters, game hogs, and others combined. In my own trips the latter part of the season, I never failed to see dozens of traps within plain sights of the wagon roads. Another family trapped 500 in as little over a week in traps set in the garden. Okay. They also have found a number of quotes, again, talking about people ate prairie chickens for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They also talk about they were able to trap so many prairie chickens in the winter and ship them to market that it was the prairie chicken trapping that kept their farm solvent, especially in years when the yield was poor. So again, just indescribable numbers of these birds out there on the landscape back in the day. Okay. In fact, they were so abundant that many considered them agricultural pests. They perpetuated quite as much mischief upon the tender buds and fruits of the orchard, as well as the grains of the field. Prairie chickens sat down in the cornfield and ruined it, much as the barbarians crowded around a city for plunder. That's a great image. The country hereabout is full of them. Pesky things are eating the farmers out of house and home. So that's what people thought about prairie chickens in the fall as they were starting to harvest their grain and put their grain away. However, in the summer, they had a different opinion, or at least some people did. The grasshoppers eaten by a single prairie chicken would be sufficient in number to destroy several bushels of grain. The birds are too valuable as grasshopper exterminators to allow their wholesale destruction by a city sportsman. So again, very, very different views from the agricultural community, depending on who you're talking to or possibly the time of year you're talking to them. Okay, getting to modern day. There are a number of blinds up in the northwest part of the state. This is one of the larger prairie chicken blinds, and you can see you can crowd quite a few people into those blinds. Although some of the blinds are a little smaller, just a couple. Some of the blinds are so close, as you can see in the pictures there on top. Prairie chickens will actually come and stand on top of the blinds and do their booming and their dancing. So you are up close and personal with these guys. It's April. It's going to be sunny in a few hours. People tend to dress too lightly. Dress like you're going out ice fishing in late January. It's an absolute blast. Bring a camera, but these blinds get really, really cold an hour before dawn in early spring. So yeah, if you can go, if you do go, it is one of the most exciting mornings you will ever spend, but do dress warmly. The other thing you can do, I can say that in 20 years, I have never actually spent a morning in a prairie chicken blind. Usually when I was up there, I was always running around counting them at different leks. I had a survey block in Clay County, and my goal was to get every lek counted 3 or 4 times so I could get a good survey of them. So if you don't have access to a blind, or the blinds are all booked up, you can just drive around and look at a map, find out where the large WMAs, WPAs are up in that part of the state. And I'll show another map here in a minute. Um, Drive, roll your window down, turn off the engine, and just listen for a few minutes. And if you can hear that booming, and cooing sound, you've got a prairie chicken lek nearby. And quite often they're fairly near the road. So I think with just maybe one exception, I did all my counting from the road, never even left my truck. There was once or twice that they were booming on the backside of a WMA or a WPA, had to get out and walk. But there's a lot of these things, a lot of these leks you can just see from the roadside, from your car or truck. Okay, so this shows where those leks, or those, I'm sorry, those blinds are. So just real briefly, these two here are up at Glacial Ridge National Wildlife Refuge. This one is, I'm not sure if this is a WMA, WPA, but just south of Twin Valley, right on the Norman Clay line. This one in Becker County, this is at Hamden Slough National Wildlife Refuge. Number 4 here, this is at Bluestem Prairie, which is a TNC property on the south side of Buffalo River State Park. And this one down here in Wilkin County, just west of Rossay, Fergus Falls is right down here. I think this is on a WMA, if I remember correctly. Anyway, up above here, this is the Minnesota Prairie Chicken Society's website. And if you go to this one and then go to how to view, if you are interested in scheduling a morning to go out to the blind, unfortunately, we don't have a single clearinghouse, but it does give phone numbers and contact emails for each of these 6 blinds, for being able to contact them and seeing if you can reserve a morning. Obviously, weekend mornings are harder to get reserved. You probably want to get started fairly early. It's already March. They're going to be starting to boom in another week or so. So those blinds are already starting to fill up. Okay. Then whether it comes to watching prairie chickens in the spring or hunting prairie chickens in the fall, and there's a special process you need to go through to get a prairie chicken license. It's not like just buying a license like you would for pheasants, and you can find that in the Minnesota DNR hunting regs books. But as far as finding them, these are birds that like big patches of grass. Kind of 320 acres is kind of a minimum. So go up into this general neck of the woods, again, kind of the Crookston to Fergus Falls. Kind of these are the Agassiz Beach Ridges right through here. Find a WMA and SNA. If you can hunt on that particular SNA, check that. Waterfowl production area, National Wildlife Refuge, again, check to see that you can hunt on all those, or private pastures if you can get permission, or a walk-in access. Find those patches that are bigger than 300 acres and start walking. These guys are not pheasants where you can find, a pheasant in a little, an acre field with some cattails in the corner. These birds like big landscapes. So you're going to put some miles on your boots and on your dog's paws. Just a little bit of a cultural difference. I don't know if this is still the case, but when I was down in the Flint Hills of Kansas through the 90s, they would set up in a field and pass shoot. Very few people hunted prairie chickens with dogs, at least back then, or at least among the people I was talking to. They would set up and basically pass shoot like you would ducks or geese. Prairie chickens will have very specific flight paths going from areas where they're feeding to areas where they're roosting, and you can time it out to the minute. So if you can figure out where their flight paths are and find a fence line or a plum thicket or something like that, a lot of people, you can just kind of hunker down and pass shoot. Or, more traditionally for this part of the world, yeah, get out there and put some miles on on feet and paws and see what you can find. Okay. Then second to last thing I'll say, just a little plug for the Minnesota Prairie Chicken Society. Their 50th anniversary is this year, and they will be having their one-day meeting in Rothsay. So again, if you go to that prairiechickens.org website, they don't have all the meeting information up yet, but kind of keep checking back. And if you're interested, that's a fun and informative and entertaining way to spend a day. And then just to want to leave you with a couple of last parting words. For those of us who work in the prairies, it can sometimes be a bit of a downer. It seems like some days it seems like, one step forward, two steps back when it comes to prairies and prairie wildlife. Turning to Aldo Leopold, he famously said one of the penalties of an ecological education is one that one lives alone in a world of wounds. And as probably most of you know, less than 1% of the original tallgrass prairie is left. So I would argue that it's probably about the most wounded landscape out there. And you can get down about that. And sometimes we all do. But one of the first graduate students, or the first two graduate students at Aldo Leopold, were Frederick and Fran Hammerstrom. And if you get into the prairie chicken literature, you will immediately run into these two names. There are some people around Minnesota that still used to work with the Hammerstroms and can still tell stories. And Frederick Hammerstrom once very famously said, the good works don't have to be done in a sepulchral atmosphere. A sepulcher is basically a graveyard or a tombstone. So yes, sometimes it seems like you're going to get down, but don't let it get you down. So I've in a couple of essays, I've been able to pair those two quotes up, and I think they really do tell a good story about both prairie as well as prairie chicken conservation. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and we can do any questions or comments.
Greg, thanks so much for sharing all that historical knowledge too. It's interesting. I'll let Amber take that slide down there. And after that, we're going to open the poll up. So if anybody wants to participate in our polling questions, again, if you don't see the poll open up here momentarily, the bottom right-hand corner, there's polling there. Pop that open. It should pop up for you. See the Fur, Fin, and Feather Club is attending again today. So thanks for joining us, folks. Seth had a great question about the air sacs. You've seen some sources that call them tympanium. Not sure I'm saying that right. And also perhaps attributed that name to their scientific name. The tympanium is a ear structure. Are the sacs aren't ears, are they?
No, they are not ears. And yeah, I sorry, I should have put left that out there. So a lot of people probably heard of either the tympanic membrane in your ear, or if you go to the orchestra, a timpani drum. Those really big drums at the back. Same thing. So the scientific name for prairie chickens is Tympanuchus cupido So Tympanuchus, that refers to the big booming neck sacs. And again, yeah, they're not ears. They're pumping air in and out of those neck sacs, so they're expanding and contracting. Cupido relates to people thought that those feathers that they pop up on the back of their head look like Cupid's feathers. Sure, okay. And then the pinnatus, that refers to the again the more proper name, pinnated grouse.
Great. Again, if you don't see the polling, bottom right-hand corner, those three little dots there, the ellipsis, pop that open and click on the polling. The polling is open right now, so thank you to those of you that are participating in that. Another question from our captioner. With the anecdotal mentions of the bird in different regions, what is it that makes us think it was a migration and not that they were widespread long before these mentions?
Yeah, and it was more of a movement, not a migration. Again, depending on who you talk to, migration kind of implies a seasonal back and forth, like ducks migrate north in the spring and south in the fall. Um, the reason we think that is because some of those earlier Euro-American explorers and early settlers never mentioned prairie chickens. and prairie chickens have a lot of meat on them. So people are always looking for a free meal. So the thought is people would have been talking about them on a fairly regular basis, and they weren't. Um, the other thing people kind of mention is, back in the day when you were out settling the prairie, breaking the prairie, you were out there from sun up to sundown every day. You were keeping a really, really close watch on what was going on in the natural world. You noticed that first day that the Canada geese came back in the spring. You noticed when the last canvasbacks disappear in the fall. Those people were watching the natural world pretty closely, and they didn't mention prairie chickens, and then all of a sudden they mentioned prairie chickens on a fairly regular basis. So again, we don't have a lot of science, but we do have a large amount of anecdotal information that in total paints a reasonably decent image.
Right. And kind of along with that, Pam or Jenna was asking, has the introduction of pheasants affected prairie chickens? And I'm not for sure exactly when pheasants were introduced to America or to Minnesota, but did that kind of fill a gap after the prairie chickens declined, or?
Yes and no. So pheasants were introduced, and I should know these dates. They were introduced to the Willamette Valley out in the Pacific Northwest in 1889, somewhere in there. Somebody can correct me. They were first introduced to Minnesota, and I should know this too. 1912 sticks in my head for some reason. May have been a little later than that. So there's a couple of answers to that question. First off, they will interact. It's not unusual in the spring to see a rooster pheasant on a prairie chicken lack. Um, they may divide up the habitat a little bit more. Pheasants can get along a little bit better in a more agricultural, row crop heavy landscape. One of the places they will interact is pheasants will parasitize prairie chicken nests. Um, so a hen pheasant will lay an egg in a prairie chicken nest as well as other pheasant hen nests. The issue is the incubation period is about a day and a half to 2 days shorter for pheasants than prairie chickens. So the hen prairie chicken sitting on her eggs, the couple of pheasant eggs hatch. She assumes those are her chicks, and she's kind of genetically programmed to move away from the nest because that's what ground nesting birds do. They hit the ground running. And what she ends up doing is she takes her 2 or 3 pheasant chicks and leaves her prairie chicken eggs to spoil. So there are interactions, but if there's plenty of good habitat on the landscape, there are lots of parts of Minnesota, Nebraska, Kansas where you can find both birds living together pretty easily.
Hmm. And Pam was asking along the population line, is the current population stable, increasing, or decreasing across Minnesota?
It's that would Yeah, I was going to look at those numbers this morning. I didn't get a chance. We had our population highs like a lot of grassland species in kind of the late 2010s when CRP was at its peak. They've kind of been tapering off since then, but they have kind of, if I'm remembering correctly, they've gone from a relatively steep decline to they've been relatively flat in numbers the last 4 or 5, 6 years, but still well below where we were, 15 years ago.
Okay. Catherine was wondering, we were talking some of the historical things of how many of these birds there were. Are there or were there any diseases or parasites associated with the prairie chickens? I can imagine with numbers as great as they were, diseases like avian flu could travel through a flock pretty quickly.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. We have absolutely no data to say yes, no, how much, how often. But yeah, we can assume that there would have been things like that. I know there have been a couple of studies published in the 1920s on the parasites of the prairie chicken. And we can assume that those parasites have been around for eons. But yeah, the answer is yes, probably, but we don't have any data to make any concrete statement along those lines.
Okay. And Jacob, here's a policy question for you, Greg, because we've got to get at least one of those in.
Surely,
Is the
yes.
Minnesota DNR actively involved in working to advance the North American Grassland Conservation Act?
Yes, we have a number of plans. There are some national regional plans. Then in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Prairie Plan. Yeah, all of those plans. It's not the DNR. It's not the DNR or the DNR plan. It's a plan for everybody. So the Nature Conservancy is involved. The Fish and Wildlife Service is involved. Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, the Minnesota Prairie Chicken Society. And yes, we are all working out there. Um, in Minnesota, we are especially blessed that we have the Outdoor Heritage Fund. We have been able to acquire um, thousands and thousands of acres in the prairie chicken range and throughout western Minnesota over since the lifespan of the Outdoor Heritage Fund. And we've put millions of dollars into restoring and enhancing a lot of that habitat. And again, that's not the DNR working alone or in isolation. That's a lot of partners working together for a common cause.
Great. Matt was, in talking about reintroduction, Matt was asking a question about, is there still a reintroduction effort in Southwest Minnesota? And last week we did a talk on the anniversary of the wild turkey reintroduction. And like you said, that was a huge effort. Not just the DNR, but National Wild Turkey Federation was founded and helped support that. What's the reintroduction efforts going on with prairie chickens now?
Yeah, and unfortunately, prairie grouse in general, prairie chicken, sharp-tailed grouse, etc. There have been a couple of kind of meta studies where, yeah, people have surveyed a bunch of previous studies. These birds do not reintroduce well. So back 15, 20 years ago, we tried to take some birds from the Agassiz Beach Ridges and move them down to Lac La Parle. And unfortunately, they did not. They hung out for a few years, but then quickly died off. And we really haven't figured out why these species don't introduce well when there are species like turkeys that do handle them well. Um, One of the goals of things like the prairie plan or some of these other plans is these birds will move by themselves. So one idea is to build basically corridors or connections from one large block of grass to another so the birds can move naturally. I know when I first started with the DNR 11, 12 years ago, um, there were some anecdotal observations of prairie chickens down in Lincoln County. And I spent a couple mornings and I actually found 3 prairie chicken leks in Lincoln County, which we haven't seen chickens there for decades and decades. Those are almost surely South Dakota birds that were moving east. They stayed here for a couple of years and then blinked out. So it really is kind of a habitat. If you build it, they will come. But as far as trapping them and moving them, it just does not work with these guys for some reason.
Well, Brian, hopefully that answers your question too about the reintroduction um, piece of that. The Fur, Fin, and Feather Club, and Brad also kind of a two-part question here. What effect do coyotes, foxes, skunks have on them? And then what is their nesting success rate?
Um, Nesting success rate is going to be relatively low, just like we see for pretty much all grassland birds. Um, I don't have a number off the top of my head, but 10, 15, 20% would probably be reasonable. Um, the question on predation, the predation, it's probably going to be very similar to the numbers that you see for pheasants, for ducks, et cetera, et cetera. Um, One interesting part about that question, because you mentioned foxes and coyotes, there was a study done out in South Dakota in late 80s, early 90s. Um, they took areas where they trapped coyotes or removed coyotes, and then they had a control area where they didn't do anything with coyotes. And they found that the area where they were trapping and harvesting and removing coyotes, they actually saw duck numbers decline. And the idea there is coyotes do not like red foxes. So coyotes will keep the red fox population low. Red fox are really good nest predators. Coyotes aren't all that good for nest predators. So by removing the coyotes, you can cause the fox populations to boom, and foxes are much better predators. In fact, even Pheasants Forever released had a news release a couple months ago, kind of along those lines. That I don't want to say that coyotes are beneficial to pheasants and prairie chickens and ducks, um, but it's a really complicated story out there when you start looking at all the different species interactions.
It's a complicated story in a lot of things with interactions.
Yes.
It's interesting. It makes our jobs interesting, right? Troy put an answer to your question in here. He says 1916 in Minnesota. So I'm guessing that's when pheasants were
Okay.
introduced to
Yeah.
Minnesota.
I was close with
Troy.
1912. Yep, somewhere in
Oh,
there.
Troy, thanks for helping us out with that. Kim was asking about a website for Greg's books. I did put a link in the chat to the Iowa Press um, site there that has his books. I'm sure you can go from there and find those. And I put a couple other things in the chat too. One, the Prairie Chicken Society. If you want to open the chat up and click on any of those links and save them for later, please do that. And another one, just a YouTube video of prairie chickens out there dancing and doing their thing. So, which is kind of fun to watch, kind of relaxing actually. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, yeah, if you just go to YouTube and punch in prairie chicken, and then after you've been fully entertained by prairie chicken, type in sharp-tailed grouse and sage grouse. And it's really fun to kind of watch all three of the prairie birds. Well, we could throw lesser prairie chickens in there also, but watching the prairie chickens, the sharp-tails, and the sage grouse kind of right after each other, and just kind of see some of the similarities and then the nuances of the difference between the species is pretty fun.
great. I get a couple questions, one from Gail and one from our captioner also. Um, Relating back to Native people, as a range of prairie chickens before settlement, has anyone checked with the Native people to see on their oral history of prairie chickens range? And then do you have any information on the cultural or hunting relationship between indigenous peoples and prairie chickens?
I looked and looked and looked for those indigenous reports, and I could not find any because I had that exact same question when I was working on the book. Um, I can say that there is among certain tribes a prairie chicken dance, um, and I know a dance. Some tribal dancers came to the Prairie Chicken Society meetings 4 or 5 years ago. One of our members had passed away, and it's kind of a tribute to him. And if you've ever seen prairie chickens out on a booming ground, and then you watched these dancers, they captured the nuance, the behavior perfectly. I mean, yes, they were people, but the tempo, the body language, the movements, they captured kind of the spirit of the prairie chicken just perfectly. It was amazing to watch.
Well, for anybody out there that has, I'm sure there's probably a YouTube video of that too. That'd be interesting to see how that goes. See, Matt, reader introduction in Southwest Minnesota. We already covered that. Sarah says, great. Thank you so much for the webinar. The polling has closed. So we have about 27% of our audience that answered the question have seen prairie chickens. So it's not too bad. Less than a third. Have any hunted prairie chickens? Only 7%. 9 people out there have actually attempted to hunt a prairie chicken. So, and how many people have spent a morning in a blind observing prairie chickens? There's 19 of you have been out there uh, experiencing the blinds. So I have not yet done that. I've seen prairie chickens around, but I've never sat in a blind form. But if I have for like the sandhill cranes in Nebraska, and you get to sit in some of those blinds. It is fantastic because you are right in the heart of the action, and just seeing and hearing all that commotion around is pretty spectacular. So I think with that, we're approaching 1 o'clock here. So Greg, did you have any other comments or questions?
No, yeah, thank you for the invitation and thanks for everybody attending and listening. And if you have follow-up questions, you can find my contact information pretty easily and just send me an email or send Benji an email and we will get back to you quickly.
Sounds good. Again, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your passion and knowledge about prairie chickens. It's we really appreciate it. So I'd like to remind everybody, we've kind of done a little series this year, with not necessarily on purpose, but we had uh, turkeys, the reintroduction of turkeys last week. We're talking about prairie chickens and how they're doing this week. Some of these historical birds that we had around and how they're doing now. And next week, we're talking about bison conservation and how we're trying to reintroduce those to Minnesota. So please join us next Wednesday, and we're going to talk a little bit about from the prairie animals to the large prairie mammals. So it'll be a good talk. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the fun weather out there. Hopefully, one more round of snow this year, and hopefully everybody can get out and enjoy the great outdoors. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.